Welcome. This is the Phoebus Ethics of Basic Income public seminar. I'm Carl Weiterquist. We will have two speakers today. Right. Now I would like to bring on Louise Haagh, our first speaker. Louise Haagh is a professor of philosophy at the University of York in York, in the United Kingdom, and she is a long-time leader in writing and organizing for basic income. She's written several books and articles on the topic over a course of years. Very prolific author, and she has also been the chair and co-chair of the Basic Income Earth Network for quite a while, and just stepped down a year or two ago. So this is Louise Haagh.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Carl, and the Institute for inviting me to the seminar series. I'm really honored to be able to speak to you all. So I'm aware that as part of the seminar, we chose an article that I wrote quite a long time ago in 2007, and I don't know how many of you have read it, but a lot of what I'm going to say today refers to that article and the thoughts I had then. And so there's a little bit of a historical perspective in that sense in my talk, because I'm going to also provide the context for what I was thinking then, and we can perhaps discuss to what extent it's still relevant. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of caveats just to put that article we're looking at in context. So the article that's the basis of my talk, it was written in 2007, some time ago. I was asked to contribute to the first issue of a new journal on philosophical economics, loosely around development ethics. And it's a bit of a spontaneous thought piece at the time. Our work has moved on into some more formal propositions and a political development theory around the relation between developmental freedom, democracy, and the state, which is the subject of some of the books I'm currently writing. But I'm not going to go into that, but rather I'm going to talk about why I wrote the article of 2007 at the time, around an institutional blind spot that I sensed in liberal theory and basic income analysis. And it was really bugging me at the time. And of course, one has to bear in mind here that I'm primarily a comparative political economist who works around and teaches development and applied ethics in development. So I can't say I'm following the conventions of political theory or the formal study of ethics in the way that I've approached the problems I discuss. But in any case, in the 2007 article on the discussion, I was beginning to formulate my reaction to what I saw as a blind spot in liberal egalitarianism and left libertarianism in terms of the treatment of work and more widely institutions. And so the piece was the first in a series of articles in which I started to explore how basic income can be set broadly within a social democratic paradigm and tradition, acknowledging that this paradigm, of course, has itself been subject to change and continues to be so. And I was provoked to do so because, having come fairly recently to the basic income field in the early 2000s and being strongly supportive of basic income, I could not understand the formal opposition to social democracy or collective institutions of work that kept being reiterated as axiomatic truth, whether in the left libertarian or the Rawlsian defense of basic income. There's not a big group of people that defend basic income from a Rawlsian perspective, but there are some people. And instinctively, this counterposition, it seemed to me wrong in the real world. And I began to wonder where it came from. And I concluded that it came from a certain type of commitment to liberal neutrality that generally taints the collective as coercive. And I thought this really had to be dealt with, investigated. So, as I said, the debate and my own thinking has moved on a bit since then, but in many ways, the problems I talked about then have to my mind, only become more pertinent as the basic income movement has gained ground in what we can describe as a very constrained context of neoliberalism and austerity. And so this is the context in which, in terms of applied ethics, it really matters, I think, how basic income is presented in relation to other institutions. And then some of these conceptual trade-offs that I was worried about nearly 15 years ago, in the sense that I think they have become even more real than they were then. So in the articles I wrote at that time around basic income and social democracy, I contest this idea of a natural position between the claim for more personal independence and unconditional security and economic equality connected with basic income on the one hand, and the collectivist governance of key human activities, or more precisely, their framing, taking from our reference the Nordic states as a comparative historical case study for sort of bringing evidence to bear on some of these issues. So what I could not understand was how human activity, work, and time were so central to basic income advocacy that were talked about as hugely important, and yet they were so institutionally underspecified to my mind. So famously, Philippe van Baartsch has on many occasions contrasted his left or real libertarianism with social democracy and measures like collective control of work time, for example. And at the time I wrote those articles, then I was beginning to explore deeper differences alongside in my other the other part of my work that's not directly connected with basic income, differences between welfare states in terms of their real governance of human activities, also central, as I said, in basic income advocacy, linked with our control of time and work and leisure. And what I found was that the collective governance of those activities, at least in Nordic states, comparably with other states, gave individuals overall more control of time. And then that is, I guess, hard to square with the libertarian neutralist arguments for basic income associated with the dominant defense of Van Baartsch, which essentially, as I said, associate social democracy with the potential, or if not actual, coercive and restrictive paternalist forms of collective governing of time. And so I found that a big part of the problem was just prior assumptions grounded in different scholarly traditions that, from my tradition, much more to do with how institutions actually structure society, whether we like it or not, and therefore we need to focus on their design. On the other hand, more in the liberal egalitarian tradition, articles of faith that in terms of liberal neutrality and a certain view of it, that frankly just seem to carry over and are made true by repetition. So I found myself up against a certain abstract commitment to liberal neutrality, development neutrality against the state, on the one hand, and then this comparative institutional evidence that does not accord with this commitment. So what I think we have here is a genuine interdisciplinary challenge, because whether in a pure theoretical basic income society, people could have more control over time than in real life social democracies is, of course, difficult to say, and it presents an odd comparison. Of course, to my mind, social democracy came very close in the late 70s to a basic income conditions like it. So I saw that there had been scope for that. But the question then is, does the answer to the choice between this hypothetical and this real case, does it answer on evidence or just abstract logic? And so here's the interdisciplinary challenge. And interesting, I noticed that Philippe, when he was queried on some of his arguments that he made in 1995, for example, and the image of the surfer on the cover of his 1995 book, in a recent conference in Cambridge a couple of years ago, and he rebuffed those questions as about the surfer image, or why had he chosen that image and so on, since it had generated so much opposition. And he said that he never understood why anyone took that image or those arguments literally. that they were not arguments about the real world, but about the hypothetical world. And so this strikes me as actually representing this interdisciplinary challenge that I'm talking about, and that's, I think, still working itself out. And so in many ways, this is, I guess, a difficulty with my project, which is that I was trying to place an institutional political economy lens informed about the real world onto arguments that work in the hypothetical and the simplified. But I had to do that. I felt I had to do that because I think against certain deeper realities about human functioning and about social life and historical evidence, many parts of the left libertarian negative construction against collective institutions simply don't stack up. And now, of course, Van Parij's work has moved on, and in his recent book with Van der Boort, he, just as Birnbaum has done more formally, they made a case for combining basic income with services, where in 1995, Philippe had said that he could see a case for universal services, creches and hospitals and so on, but, quote, he could not find any principled reason to defend them. And so he clearly has found one, but I still think that Van Parijs and also Birnbaum, to a lesser degree, evade the institutional collectivist question of work and development. In Van Parijs' case, by still pitching basic income as an alternative to work time regulation, just for an example. And I remember we were at a conference in Florence, I think it was 2005, and we were discussing Philippe's book with Yannick when it was just a manuscript. And my main comment then was that why do you need to set up basic income as an alternative to the collective governance of paid work time? Why can't we combine these things? But it's still there in the book, this alternative framework. So I think Philippe is saying that through a basic income, our lives can be unaffected by the formal productive sphere, which is one that we can move in and out of without cost, which is a proposition many feminist political economists, of course, have taken issue with. But I think that the problems lie deeper in terms of the way human lives, not just women's lives, but human lives, are bounded by certain developmental constraints that I talk about in the article. And essentially, I argue there are two forces that constrain our control of time, human and systemic, and the basic income cannot remove either of these forces. It can change them, it can improve the situation, but I don't think a basic income can remove these forces. So in human terms, we need to develop and gain skills, we need to learn to cooperate as equals, we need to be cared for, we need to care for others, at times not always of our choosing. We are cognitively constrained by our affiliations that affect how we feel, how we think. Occupations cannot be acquired or sustained without support. Jobs can't just be shed without cost because our skills may be related to them, our experiences and so on. And we age, but we still want to contribute, and so on and so forth. And so in the context of these types of innate constraints that we share, to retain real control of time, I argue that we need collective arrangements that protect our opportunities so that we do not have to negotiate all of these conditions ourselves, but a sense of developmental justice prevails from which we can just take and benefit without having to be strong enough to negotiate every situation and every conflict. So my argument is essentially that if we're not proactive about these constraints on our independence and our standing as equals throughout a whole lifetime, then our independence and relatedly our developmental liberties will be compromised through our social interactions, even with the best will in the world. And I suppose here I'm sympathetic to Anka Geo's case for gender-neutral lifestyles in the sense that this is something that needs to be crafted. It doesn't mean that we all have to have the same lifestyles, but it means that we do not have to negotiate our constraints when we choose. So for me, basic income in these terms is very important. It is, in fact, an institution of developmental liberty, in my opinion, but it isn't sufficient. And so, as already said, I don't think the problems that I describe here are confined in any way to left libertarianism, but that the seeds of those problems are evident in many areas of Anglo-liberal theory, which is why I also talk about Rawls and Rawlsian perspectives on basic income in the article as flawed, as suffering institutional blind spots in that 2007 article. And I point to tensions in Rawls. I mean, Rawls on the one hand is of course recognizes developmental liberty in one sense in terms of his Aristotelian principle, motivation and fellowship, but he doesn't develop it in institutional terms and even goes against it in some parts of his work, and as I discuss in the article. So essentially in that article and other articles, I argued that human activity and its connection with well-being is a blind spot in liberal theory, and it carries over into liberal egalitarian thought and into many areas of basic income analysis. And some of the debates we focus on, Rawls versus Nozick, and then left libertarians and so on, actually some of those protagonists actually share some prima facie assumptions that are problematic, even though we usually think of these figures as opposing each other. And so in terms of applied ethics, then, how I think we should judge political circumstances, and that's also as activists and active scholars and so on, is informed then by what I think is a more broad-based account of the connection between human functioning freedom and economic institutions. And we cannot afford to be too loose in our compromises in order to get basic income popularly accepted. And that has been something I've said for a long time, and it has got me into trouble sometimes. And you'll no doubt object in a moment, asking questions, that basic income advocates, again, talk a lot about work and time and do not take our control of these for granted, and that is true. But I'm still going to argue that whether for opportune or for formal reasons, and I think the discourse to a certain extent have become entwined in terms of the opportune and the formal, there is this growing tendency to talk about these things in too voluntarist, too hopeful terms, perhaps. And so, although basic income advocates made human activity central in claims for basic income, like the possibility to control work time and care and the relationship between these, for me, this is done in a way that too much rests on basic income alone. And of course, you can argue that, well, let's leave all that aside and at least let's just get basic income in first. And I don't disagree with that, but I think we shouldn't wait to just talk about these problems till that happens. And in particular, I don't think, of course, that this I refer to as mono-institutionalization of basic income needs to be an implication of a case for basic income at all, and that making it an implication has serious pitfalls then in reality. And so in that article, then I wanted to clarify what an alternative case for basic income in terms of control of activities that does take real structural constraints into account might look like, and I counterpose that then to what we might call the more singular case. And in the broadest terms, a singular case, I think there are many manifestations of that, but it's one in which basic income is central within the social and economic system or is sufficient in any case. I think sometimes singularity is mild. It's just a case of a focus of activism that has become issue-based against certain constraints and opportunities. And so that's at the level of discourse and action. In a recent article, I also argue, incidentally, that singularity and a compensatory focus in basic income analysis has roots, very deep roots in Anglo-liberal history in terms of reaction to high inequality. Carl, of course, has argued that it is notable that basic income enters the scene when there is a crisis, when high inequality becomes politicized. And I think that's not an accident. In other cases that I'm interested in the article, singularity is a theoretical proposition. It's not just a political phenomenon, analytical one. And so an example of that I already might have hinted at is when political theories talk about what a basic income society might look like, when, to my mind, from an institutional perspective, this is a false construction. So basic income is an institution, and it's an important one, but it's not an institution that can define a society per se, because that's just too much else going on, okay? And around the time that I wrote this article, I'd just been to a conference in Oxford titled The Basic Income Society. So I was primed by that. And I do remember that one of the arguments I made there in that conference was that the case for basic income on grounds that it increases autonomy, and so we can remake the world, was much more plausible then, or before neoliberalism, and much less plausible after it. And so essentially libertarians in the 80s or back in the 70s were able to take stable institutions for granted and yet ignore them analytically. And now we don't have that luxury. We don't have that luxury. So therefore, that's one of the reasons I think some of the arguments are made then, whether they're completely right or wrong, but I think it's still relevant. So I argue that singularity derives justification at a theoretical level from different areas of liberal theory that are committed to liberal neutrality in a sort of ex-ante unexamined way, in a way that disguises or outright rejects the structuring of choices by the state or wider collective forces that we can't escape. We can't escape them, but we can shape them, I think. And so to make my critique and also highlight the sort of shape of an alternative, more broad-based case for basic income in institutional terms, I made the proposition in the article for what I called a developmental freedom-based welfare governance. And I said that this included basic income, shared welfare, and the promotion of occupational stability, not the guarantee, but the promotion of occupational stability by society. So I suppose I was anticipating the addition of universal services that has now become axiomatic, but I still think it isn't enough. So in summary, if I got 5 minutes, loosely based on the article, I made essentially 3 points. So first, I highlight the institutional blind spot in liberal egalitarian theory that I argue is not been helped by the frequent reliance by liberal egalitarians on neoclassical economic arguments about the natural market supply and demand of jobs and the pricing of work. I think, for instance, Philippe has relied on that. I argue also that even the new social contractual paradigm around duty-based reciprocity, which is often represented as the opposite to basic income, such as represented in Stuart White's work on the civic minimum, it's now some time ago, but which incorporates a sort of market contractual idea of work that goes against developmental freedom as a superior value. And I discuss that in the book. And because Stuart White has since changed his mind, I think, and is much more supportive of basic income now. And second, so in the article, I present reasons why a more substantive notion of developmental freedom is helpful to bring to light the institutional problems and constraints on redistributive policies and on basic income as a standalone institution. And third, I discuss how, in the light of institutional and cooperative constraints on freedom that make certain wider forms of sharing risk pertinent and important, that we can make a defense of basic income that is, in a word, more demanding, and that has the wider question of an ordered economy in view, but an ordered economy that is different to the punitive policies some associate, I think not quite accurately, descriptively or normatively, to the idea of an economic order, for example, in the guise of social democracy. So just to make clear, in the article, I make reference, and it's even in the title, I make reference to social order, partly to raise the stakes of my argument and, in a sense, to be provocative, because in one way I still want to challenge the ideal of an unordered and unpatterned world within neutralist and libertarian arguments in general, and for basic income specifically. That, of course, has been, I think, very, very influential, not the only argument, but influential. So we can go back to Hayek, for example, and of course, in a well-known passage, defended a subsistence guarantee that we say that he's also a sort of defender of a form of basic income. But he also said that the world is unordered. So one morning he had breakfast in New York and he got an epiphany that the contents of his breakfast were so varied, the sausages and the eggs or whatever it came, they were so varied in source that no one could have possibly planned it, where they came from, how they were priced and so on. And from that, he derived that there are no, and we should not think of patterns in the world, because doing so is to go against natural forces, and that's coercion. Of course, that was his critique of Rawls as well. And so Hayek's, that was informed Nozick's critique of Rawls rather. And so Hayek's project was to expand the sphere of the possible, whatever that is, against the coercion of the regulated. And so this meant that he had to will away shared constraints and our collective interest in developing overall better institutions, at least from my perspective as an institutional economist. He had to wish all that away. So now one reason I mentioned Rawls then in the article is that, of course, he recognized developmental liberty, as I said, as a thing and a good in his characterization of developmental motivation and its companion principle, and that we enjoy fellowship and so on in the carrying out of our plans and the things that we do. But Rawls, he also did seem to think that it was possible to arrange background institutions of basic equality of opportunities against which then dynamic outcomes would be tolerable. And I argue in the article that his countervailing difference principle, which was a form of correction of inequalities, was very vague and imprecise. And of course, a later defense of basic income on a Rawlsian premise also pits basic income against the idea that we must enter a world of collective production. I'm thinking of Catriona McKinnon's defense, also published in Basic Income Studies at about the same time, 2007, I think. Now, I think Van Parijs performed a trick by saying that the difference principle could be read in terms of entitlement to leisure, then which would justify basic income terms that Rawls could recognize. But if we are to take Rawls' Aristotelian principle seriously, I think this will not do, because they can only really be manifest under arrangements where making and sticking to plans and forms of fellowship in society are possible. And again, a basic income isn't enough for that. And so in the article, I try to square the circle by making two arguments. First, I argue that a cooperative order like social democracy does not have to have the punity implications that Stuart White seemed to suggest in his civic minimum. And in later articles, I've shown that comparably, social democracy has been, and even still is, less punitive, although it's more punitive now than it was, far more, vis-a-vis the unemployed than the anti-liberal states. And I also argue that this suggests that actual equality in society is constructed by institutions, as in the Nordic case, it's a very difficult thing to do. Institutions that stabilize opportunities in many spheres: care, leisure, occupation, and income, and the combination of these. And so I think there is an underlying logic to the way that social democratic welfare institutions did become less conditional in comparative terms, as we saw especially in the 70s and early 80s, and even carrying over from then. We're talking about unemployed persons notionally having to claim entitlement. There wasn't a basic income, but could do so for 7 years without any real harassment back in those days. And then, of course, that has been rolled back. And I also think that the Nordic states, just looking at history long term, they show that actual equality promotes unconditionality. So even if basic income was never implemented in the Nordic states, states like Norway, Denmark, and Finland, and more so than Sweden, they approach conditions of unconditionality, as I said before, when equality through these other institutions was higher. So I think when Klaus Offe famously has referred to the overburdening of European states in the late 70s, which was really his case for post-work paradigm, which is also relevant, this overburdening to the Nordic states, I don't think it was quite as relevant to the Nordic states, precisely because they had expanded equality through institutions into the domain of leisure and care in a way that Germany had not done. And that also shaped how they dealt with neoliberalism. Not last, or not in terms of the, in terms of the defense then of basic income, for me, looking at the Nordic states in comparison, the implication is that we can see basic income as an institution that broadly fits social democratic principles of solidarity in human development, and that without basic income, control of time and activities in other institutions is strained, as neoliberalism has proven. So for that reason, I also disagree with many activists in Nordic states now who see a basic income as an extension of flexicurity in Nordic states. So flexicurity is the acceptance of more precarious work in exchange for basic security, flexicurity. And this, to me, was, to my mind, in any case, was always a sort of Faustian bargain that was struck in the 90s. It was a birth child of the Nordic version of neoliberalism, in a way that the Nordic state was amplified. And flexicurity was a corruption of social democracy by neoliberalism. Under flexicurity, the punitive conditionalities arose really for the first time, I mean, implemented certainly in Denmark, my birth country, in a way that they hadn't existed before. And even when they are more humanist in implementation, so for example, in Denmark, there's a limit to how much your benefits can be cut, whereas in the United Kingdom, they can be cut entirely for a number of years, and you can be cast outside of society completely. There's this difference. They are still a breach with the social democratic humanist tradition. So when in the articles I wrote in the late 2000s, I made this notional defense of basic income within the terms of an altered social democratic model. I was not thinking of any form of social democratic or Nordic model, because, as I said, there has been a change and a corruption. But rather, I was making in terms of, first, the real historical evidence we have that collectivizing human development conditions tend towards a basic income, not away from it. And also in terms of the prospect of conditions for real control of time prevailing in conditions under which developmental freedom is recognized as a superior standard for the design of our institutions. And thereby I end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks a lot. We have some students who are ready to respond. Julie?
Hello, good afternoon. I just have some questions to ask, and that's all. So the first one goes, in the paper, it is said that the influence of the automatic account on liberal egalitarian thought has produced an ambitious, imprecise, and in the case of welfare contractualism, a coercive account of both individual freedom and social community. Mm-hmm. So this might not be the smartest question you get, but I couldn't fully understand what it means. Could you please elaborate?
How much time have you got? So in terms of the welfare contractualist argument, I think I illustrated that sort of in quite a lot of depth, just by taking Stuart White's The Civic Minimum, where, I can't remember the precise suggestion, but there is the suggestion that somehow parents need to be punished if they can't provide for their children, I mean, for example. So to me, that's a punitive, or that is a very strange punitive implication of sort of a reciprocity argument that doesn't need to be there, but it's there because Stuart White, in fact, relies, I think, on the market contractualist paradigm. In the end, that, we derive our income from our labor, and that's the only place we should or can derive it. And if we don't, we can be punished because we've taken on responsibilities for children. I mean, I think if he hadn't adopted the market contractualist paradigm, he couldn't have made that punitive implication. And I mean, later on, I think Stuart White has changed his mind in light of neoliberalism. He can now see that is wrong, because with the precarization of jobs, you can no longer hold parents responsible. I mean, I don't think you could, actually responsible, but I don't think you could ever hold them responsible in principle anyway. So, I don't agree with him anyway. In terms of the atomistic account of human nature, I mean, the market contractualist paradigm is an atomistic account of human nature because it tells us that we relate to others and square bargain and keep promises to others, etc., through contracts in the market. And of course, in actual real life, we have a range of commitments that make up our whole being and our whole identity and our existential being and so on. So that's the atomistic account of human nature. And I mean, I think just to egg the pudding, I mean, I think even Rawls, so I take Rawls because he's someone who you'd think doesn't do that, but I think even Rawls, in a way, does that, partly where he talks about the pricing of work as being somehow market-based and then needs to be compensated for. But actually, there are ways in which we can organize employment and paid activity that is fairer. We don't have to do it the market way, right? I mean, we should combine that with the basic income, in my opinion. It's not organize employment properly or a basic income, it's organize employment properly and a basic income. And then you are recognizing more fully all of the aspects of our being. I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, it does, surely. The other one goes, if the realistic adoption of liberal neutrality was adopted, what would have happened in that case? And what is the idealistic adoption of liberal neutrality?
Is that something in the article?
Yeah.
Did I say idealistic or realistic? Or is that something you just, terms that you just introduced? Just so I know. Because I haven't reread the whole article. I'm just wondering, did I say that?
Yeah, I guess, according to my understanding, maybe.
Oh, really? Well, this is very, very complicated. I mean, the whole question of liberal neutrality, what it means, is very complicated because it can mean a lot of different things. And I do think that under this sort of market contractual paradigm, very generally in Anglo-liberal thought, liberal neutrality has been sort of taken to, and in particular, it's been taken by libertarians as sort of their preserve, but actual liberal neutrality can just mean impartiality, in hiring practices or meritocracy in giving of exam results or whatever. I mean, liberal neutrality is sort of pervasive, but I think that the neutralism, or liberal neutrality in that guise is your Hayek or your Nozick. That is the idea that the state is always coercive. This is the idea of the breakfast, as I say. I mean, if you try to not just make patterns, but if you start looking for or recognize patterns, you are already inviting coercion, because then you have to respond to them, and then the state has to be active, and then individuals' choices are not as open as they might be, and blah blah blah. So, I mean, that is neutralism as in sort of ex ante. Let's not examine this. But I think I think it is in Rawls. I think it is in Van Parijs. Van Parijs is always saying, "Oh, liberal neutrality, I mustn't go against," and he doesn't actually explain where and when it ends or begins. And the same with Rawls. He says, "Well, priority of liberty, obviously, priority of liberty, But in what sense priority of liberty? Where? How? Which aspect of liberty? Because there are conflicts between different forms of liberty, right? In reality, and so I just think there is this almost mystified idea of priority of liberty and anti-state discourse around this liberal neutralism.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your words. It really helped.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and now Marvin Roche has some comments, right, Marvin?
Yep. I only have one point, and it's about. I mean, this article is about work and labor and its implications for how we live and how we are. And I mean, what it does to us on an individual level and to our society, and how that is intertwined, if I understood it right.
Mm.
And I think this is a really curious part of UBI, a very central part. And what I stumbled upon in your article, which is you also said that in this talk now, that a part of the article is assumptions, misconceptions that both sides in the discourse sort of just accept, like neoliberal assumptions, and that is a mistake. And there was one particular one that you call the misconception of a work-leisure trade-off.
Oh, yeah.
And if I understood that correctly, that is something I would strongly challenge, because even if we become this society where everybody enjoys their work and can incorporate these different elements that are important for individual well-being, even then I think there is still a trade-off between leisure time and work. And so yeah, maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah. No, I agree. But I mean, this is again, theories appropriate words, and then they become to mean, they come to mean what those theories defined them to mean. So, I mean, the leisure work trade-off really in applied economics, in applied ethics and neoliberal theory means something specific. It means people will always prefer leisure to work, and therefore they must be made to work. That's what it means. And that justifies, low income benefits. It justifies, the argument, don't make people too secure because they'll take advantage, blah, blah, blah. But of course, I agree, there is a trade-off between too much work and leisure, and there's trade-offs between forms of time. What I'm arguing for is to frame our institutions and social interactions on a macro scale in such a way that people can make choices that don't become trade-offs between those forms of time. So, for example, one issue I had a slight issue with, there's a book, I forgot his name now, but it's about unstructured time. So it's about this idea that there should be a certain amount of time that we should all have that's unstructured. And this could be like a day a week or 4 hours a day or whatever. And I just remember thinking, well, that's all very well, but if the other areas of time are totally coerced and stressed, then A, you can't take your unstructured time, and B, you can't enjoy it. So I think what I'm trying to argue is that we do need to reflect as a society on how the different activities that we all end up doing in different degrees are generally structured in the society so that we can enjoy all the different forms of time. I don't buy that just by choosing to do more of one or more or less of the other in an unstructured world, we have control, because we might not have control of the way we're doing things in that time. The way we work, the way we care may be traded off by unhappiness or stress in the other areas. So, and so that's why I think basic income does contribute to giving us more control of our choices and of our time, when we can do things, when we can make choices, etc. But I don't think it gives us full control over the content of that time or the social relations in those forms of time.
In that case, I would like to follow up quickly, because I think there is some forms of labor and work, no matter how you structure them, where people would always choose leisure over that particular job. That might be different for different people, but I think you might also agree that there are some forms of labor where people definitely gonna choose leisure every time, even if it's
but that's why we
labor.
need good incentives for people to do that job, so that people shouldn't be forced to do those jobs out of necessity. That's why basic income is important. But it's also important, assuming in the real world the basic income isn't going to be enough to live a full life. Because I think we have to look at the reality that maybe at the end of the day, maybe once we've tasted basic income, once we've tried it, we might want more and more of it. And maybe one day we will have a basic income society. I don't know. It's a bit like communism. Maybe one day we'll be in a society where we can fish in the afternoon and hunt in the morning or whatever. But I don't think we get there by just imagining it and then transitioning through some sort of revolution. We get there by actually living by some of the values through institutions we create that enable that kind of way of being. I don't know if that answers your question. I can't remember what you oh yeah, so there's always going to be things we don't want to do. Yeah, well, I mean, as far as possible, we should not compel people to do things, so we should use incentives. And so that's why I still think that organizing work and paying people properly, or thinking about how people can be made incentivized to do things, is important. We can't just leave it to the market.
I might follow up again. That would be a very nice, the point I made would be a very nice argument for a UBI, because it would give the negotiating power to people to, for example, get really well paid for these jobs that nobody wants to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I think it depends on the level of basic income. I really do think it depends on the level. And I'm just a bit skeptical that we're going to get, in reality, to a decent level for some time, sadly. And I think what is important now, you know, as an activist, I've said what's really important is to try and tell people why it still matters to have that status equality. Even if basic income can't fulfill everything we want it to, that it brings about a status equality we haven't had. And that has many ramifications that I think are really important for making other changes. So I agree with that, but I just don't see it being high enough for a while. I don't know. I'd be interested to know what Carl thinks about that.
Let's ask him.
I don't know what I don't know what the future holds for getting legislation passed, getting politics to change. My specialty is not in predicting that kind of thing, and I think most of the people who do predict on that don't have a very good record of being correct when they do. My concern is that we push in the right direction and we take any victory, large and small, we can get.
Yeah.
Going for the small victory, I think, is sometimes a mistake, because you say, well, there's less in our critics to oppose if we go for something very, very small step in this direction. That is true. There is less for our critics to oppose, but also there is less reason for our supporters to get out there on the streets and say, we have to do this. People will push and push hard for something that's going to change their lives, not a small gimmicky program.
Yeah.
So we've got to be pushing. We've got to be pushing for this. But I do believe we've got to be pushing for the full thing. But sadly, we'll probably have to compromise along the way and start out with some smaller things.
Yeah.
And you got to take heart in a daily victory. We've had too many defeats.
Well, I agree. I just personally found it hugely frustrating being from a Nordic state. You know, I know why a lot of Nordic people are fearful of basic income, and it's because of the way we have presented the case against social democracy. It's been very important to me to demonstrate that this is an unnecessary opposition, and there are people who think that these things have been and can be compatible.
Okay, I have Dritan with his hand up. Go ahead, Dritan.
Okay. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. You mentioned incentives, and that's some kind of nudging from the government. Yeah, and from this point of view, I guess we are teaching people preferences and not abilities to correctly assess the risks and estimate the probability from an unfortunate event and the policy implications that come out of it. So we may make people more parasitic and put them in a situation where they expect that government would lead them towards a particular way.
I totally disagree with you. Well, thank you for your question.
That was I needed some clarification on that.
Well, I mean, I just don't think, first of all, I don't think there's any evidence for that. So, this is really important. I mean, if we take the Nordic states, as you know, that they would be your classic parasites then, right? I mean, the Nordic population would be your classic parasites. But, you know, if you look at public opinion or values in those states, they are the least conformist. You know, so there's really very little evidence that more security, more collectivist action make people conformist. It may make people, it may make people buy into these collective goods. But in terms of the range of interests or ideas or that people have or the values that they hold, we don't see that. And in terms of whether people work, I think as a survey was done on work values, there was 0.02% that said that they wouldn't bother to work if they had, you know, security. So the evidence isn't there. But I mean, the other thing that's problematic from what you're saying is it assumes that we can teach people to assess risks and probabilities in the marketplace in the bigger society. Of course, we can't teach something that people can't do ever. So to me, that's a completely red herring. I mean, and in any case, it's also false that the more we marketize, you know, the more open our possibilities become. I mean, look at the stock market, right? How many people are there? How many people participate there? And how many people understand the risks and probabilities there? So A, it's totally hierarchical, and B, it's totally opaque. And so our society, we as citizens need structured information, not from a mono state, but, you know, from a very vibrant, pluralistic, research-based, politically active society. But that's not what you get in a market context. There you just get less information, complete opaqueness, and this very idea that nothing can be planned or organized in the world, which is, you know, it's frankly dangerous. It's an anti-scientific proposition.
Okay, Bernie, you're next.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting contribution, Louise. I have only a very, very short comments. First of all, I looked at my manuscripts when I taught, in my basic income lecture for the last time, the aspect of punitive justice. I was very inspired by you to teach that once again, because it's more than 5 or 6 years away. And the reason for that is that no one was interested in the punitive justice of basic income. It's a lost gimmick. I do not know why, but it is very important. And you presented here some ideas about how to put this again into the logic. A second concerning the Nordic model, and that's what I call, as we do it in Germany, the German market economy approach is, from our point of view, the Nordic model seems to be more cooperative, living together, whereas in Germany, we believe strictly in the competitive economy. And concerning the competitive economy means that we have to believe more in labor income, in market income, than in other kinds of income. So therefore, because I'm an ordo-liberalist, I was also very near by Hayek and many others here in the Freiburg tradition. I completely left that argument when I, and that's important for me, inspected basic income more heavily, that you see that competition is what we could say the macho organization, the male version of the economy. And if we add to this care economy, then we have a more female institutional idea about what work really is. And therefore, no wonder why in Germany, the care economy is on the one hand very expensive, but on the other hand, clearly underdeveloped. A fourth remark is what the neoliberals or the libertarians take care about, what I would call, and what my colleague also, Mr. Vanberg, called very often as a scholar of Hayek, is the enabling state with respect to the protective state. Not the productive state in the interest of James Buchanan and other contractarians, or the redistributive state, but a protective state. With that, Yeah, it's allowed for the neoliberal, for the libertarian government to be highly coercive if someone tries to do something against the protective state in the sense of private property. Yeah. Therefore, you see, again, in these states, we are not interested as a self-fulfilling prophecy in common pool or common property organizations. A very big mistake in Germany also. Mm-hmm. My last argument is, I do not know if I understood you quite right, because you said in neoclassical economics, in the neoclassical model, we have a leisure-work trade-off. For me, it is not a leisure-work trade-off, because one is the residual of the other. Yeah? For me, it's a trade-off between market income and leisure, because market income in a composite commodity gives you utility, and leisure gives you utility. And because leisure gives you utility, that's also your consequence. Work can be only a private bad, not a public good. Therefore, and my solution to your question is straightforward. I will publish a paper with an assistant. We are finalizing the paper at the moment, where we show that the old-fashioned tradition in economics, the thinking in economics is that with consumption, this means labor income, and on the other hand, work, we have additive separability. Yeah? Work is effort. Work is bad and has to be compensated by the wage. And all what is good is consumption of goods, consumption of leisure time. In our model, we switch to multiplicative, that's what we call time sovereign, multiplicative combination of labor time, unearned work, and creative leisure time. And then the world totally changed. So my argument is, it is a very important part of basic income that it socializes individuals towards more control, individual control of time, towards time sovereignty. Mm-hmm. My last argument on that, one interesting aspect is in our model that we can show that some tax bases don't show the Laffer curve anymore. It's not a hump shape. For example, the consumption tax, increases whenever the basic income tax increases. Yeah, there is, you could say, an asymptotical development towards the maximum amount, but never a Laffer curve. And that's a very interesting result of the basic income socialization. What do you think about that? That's my only question. The other things are more or less hints you may ignore or you might find fruitful.
No, I mean, just hugely interesting comments. Really, really interesting reflections there as well. I'll need to think more about it and take that on board. But the Laffer curve in basic income socialization, I'm 100% sure I follow you, because we don't have basic income socialization as yet. So do you mean just in theory?
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. We don't have evidence because we don't have a state with basic income. So therefore, there is only, so to speak, the theoretical armchair evidence that when we argue that a basic income serves for time sovereignty, then one can show it in a multiplicative time usage model, incorporating consumption time, consumption of goods. And then we see that the Laffer curve, at least for some tax bases, is vanishing. And that was a surprise, and it's very interesting for me to recognize that. So this means that it is relatively easy to finance a basic income when the basic income socialization towards time sovereignty works. Yeah, that's a wholly theoretical argument at the moment, not an empirical argument.
But I don't know if this is an answer, but you just make me think, again, I come back to the Nordic states, because Nordic states have, I think, a kind of unique combination of low average working hours. I mean, Holland does better, but the problem with Holland is that the gender distribution of the work time is so unequal that, well, there seems to be an implication because of the way because work time is not collectively reduced, but reduced through part-time work, primarily taken by women. We don't have a whole system sort of experiment. But in the Nordic countries, we have a very high equal distribution of informal, so time, household tasks. The gender distribution of household tasks is, I think, the most equal in the Nordic states, or at least some of them. At the same time, you have a low level of working hours and high levels of leisure. And you have a very high level of socialization of resources of income. So the social wage is a very high level of GDP. So I don't know. I mean, it doesn't exactly amount to basic income, but I think what it shows to me, and I don't know, if we had a basic income society, as I said before, where we are able to tax machines or we're able to tax something and then distribute it all, what would things look like? That's hard to say. But in Nordic states, by whatever means, we have organized a situation in which we have a very high level of socialization of income. It might not be just in the redistributive income, but also because the way in which income is distributed through the tax system is more egalitarian and so on and so forth. So we have a situation that could resemble the situation you're talking about. Does that make sense? I'm not.
Yeah. I think a very interesting hint for me to see if I can draw from that some empirical evidence. Thank you very much. That's very important.
But just to mention, Ugo Colombino, he made some estimates about which countries could afford a basic income.
Oh, thank you very much. I stay in touch with Ugo. Thank you. Yeah, I never minded this, so thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Louise, thank you very much. This ends the seminar with Louise. We'll now take a 5-minute break and resume before 5:15 for Atto Lecto. Thanks a lot, Louise, and see you all in 5 minutes.